Okay, so today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look back at Theme Park, a game which was highly acclaimed at the time for its then incredibly unique take on how a game could be made, combining both the city building aspects of the SimCity series with business management aspects, and dressing it up with the motif of building and running an amusement park. This was essentially one of the first games to do this sort of thing, whereas nowadays we typically think of this formula as being a, quote, tycoon game of some sort. In fact, one of the successors to this game, which I own and played a ton of when I was younger, was Roller Coaster Tycoon. And at first glance, that game and this game play remarkably similar. But, I don't have an easy way to say this, so I hate this game. Roller Coaster Tycoon is essentially this game right here, Theme Park, but with every single user-hostile aspect removed. Yeah, Theme Park has not aged well, given that it has a lot of features and there's a lot of things which essentially comes down to killing off every bit of enjoyment you might get out of this thing as a new player. Now, if you know what to do and how to succeed, then there's absolutely enjoyment to be had here. But if you're brand new to this game like I am, and go in expecting to just be able to put together whatever kind of amusement park you want and have it work out right, oh no, you are sadly mistaken. This game is out for blood, and every time you think you've got a handle on it, you're suddenly slapped back down by some little feature you weren't expecting. This is effectively a game where you play perfectly or you lose, plain and simple. I made 3 separate attempts to get anywhere in this thing. First with the full simulation aspects in place, then again with the simulation model scaled back a bit, and then even tried one more time in the sandbox mode as it supposedly has. But no, all 3 attempts ultimately came to an end for one reason or another, well before I was even a fraction of the way through everything. 2 of which were related to game-breaking bugs. Yeah, I was hitting game-breaking bugs before even getting the ability to lay down my first roller coasters, which sucks because that's one of the things you'll want to do right from the start. But no, you have to research them first, and they're far up the tech tree, thus if you don't know exactly what you're doing, you're going to lose before they're unlocked. Also, something I want to quickly point out before we get too deep into this thing is that I'm generally really good with games made by Bullfrog. They made a lot of my favorite PC games, and they're also one of the few companies who made strategy games that I could actually wrap my head around. And yet despite that, I never played this game as a kid, and up until now I wasn't 100% certain why I'd skipped on it. But, just like with Titus the Fox, I think my subconscious was locking into something subtle, which made me realize this was a game that I should avoid. And now that I'm older and can analyze my own thoughts and feelings way better, the corporate speak used throughout this entire game is extremely off-putting. Like, just the fact that the visitors to your parks are constantly referred to as, quote, the little people, is nearly enough to make me just want to punch a hole through my screen. Theme Park was developed by Bullfrog Productions, published through Electronic Arts in 1994, and is effectively a one-player simulation game. As with a lot of Bullfrog's titles, it supports VGA 320x200 graphics, as well as SVGA 640x480 graphics, all running with 256 colors, and supports a fairly typical array of audio devices. And keeping in mind the only sound effects in the game are digitized, thus devices like the original AdLib or MT32 are only supported for music. I should point out too though that some aspects of the game switch back to 320x200 out of 640x480 when they're accessed, even though the game supports displaying those same things at 640x480 when they're accessed in a non-standard way. Yeah, it's a bit confusing, but the short of it is that you frequently go back to 320x200 for brief moments when running the game at 640x480, so just something to keep in mind. As for its current release state, it's still commercial but easy to obtain either digitally or physically. Digital copies can be grabbed from the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com for $6 normally, but this game always goes on sale pretty much once a month for just $1.50, so definitely wait for one of those sales before grabbing it. As for physical copies, if you just want a loose CD, you can find them even cheaper for just $1 or $2, with jewel case copies tending to go for closer to $10, and fully boxed copies, not counting the very original release, going for around $20. The thing to keep in mind here is that EA did this thing where after an original run of a game, they now do multiple additional runs as an EA Classics release. And thus there are a lot more of those copies floating around compared to the original box. That said, despite how rare the original boxed copy is, it also tends to only go for between $20 and $40. Some sellers try to capitalize on the rarity with ludicrous prices, but I cannot find any records of anyone paying those kinds of prices for it. But again, it is still legitimately rare now, so it's kinda hard to tell where the median price is even supposed to be. All of that said, you do have to keep a few things in mind when you go tracking down a copy. The first is that the game was released for numerous platforms, and while the DOS version is one of the more common ones, you do have to keep in mind to get the game for the specific platform that you want. The second thing to keep in mind is that there are a lot of games following this one which have theme park in the name, but are not this game. So those search results routinely get mixed in with results for this game, no matter how much filtering you do. But the last thing to keep in mind if you want a copy at all is actually a strike against the digital release on GOG. See, this was a very early title to show up on GOG. Not the earliest by far, but early enough that the amount of effort put into this release wasn't all that high. As such, the GOG release lacks any kind of supplemental material, and trust me, without a manual, this game is going to destroy you. If you do grab the digital version, make sure you source a replacement manual from somewhere if you want any hope of surviving. One of the first things you do when you start up Theme Park, following a fairly lengthy 3D animation which runs at a variety of frame rates for some curious reason, is enter a nickname. This is essentially a profile name that is tracking your finances globally across every run through the game you make, which is a bit weird considering that there's saving and loading mechanics on top of this which are separate to the overall experience. It'll make more sense why this is a weird thing later in the episode. But the general aim of the game is to make amusement parks in various parts of the world and use the profit to build even bigger amusement parks in more lucrative places. Though when you go to start a new park, you're first asked some preliminary questions about how to set up the simulation, including the game asking you to input your age. Now, naturally, I tried to lie and entered a whole bunch of 9s, but apparently the age is stored in a assigned character as it tops out at 127, so I guess that's what we're going with. More importantly though, you can set a bunch of options which basically reflect difficulty, including rivals, visitor happiness for the first few years of any park, the start level, which merely sets how much cash to give you if you've never made a park before, but the most important option of all is the sim level, which has 3 settings: sandbox, simulation, and full. Full mode is basically the entire game with all aspects of the simulation enabled. Simulation mode removes a handful of the more insipid simulation aspects, specifically the stock market and stocks. And no, those are 2 different things, which even the manual reminds you not to get confused about. Stocks is actually in reference to cold storage of perishable goods, which easily could have been referred to as inventory instead to allay confusion, but then what do I know? Sandbox mode is not what you think it is though. Basically, it turns off even more simulation aspects, specifically research and certain aspects related to your park employees, making up for the lack of research by awarding new things to build after every year. The irony being that because of how research works, you often end up getting these same things at the start of new years and the other sim levels too. So yeah, the sandbox mode really isn't all that much easier than the simulation mode, and it has some of its own quirks that we're going to get into later. You also have the option to change the simulation level at any point you want, but this is severely bugged out and can cause certain aspects of the simulation to just suddenly stop working entirely, even if you change it back. So whatever you do, do not change the simulation level mid-game. The next thing you need to do is buy land to set up your park. Now the UK is specifically set up as a starting place where you don't have to spend any money to buy the land, and thus is always an option, especially if your last attempt to make a park goes very wrong. And once the land is bought, you start running the park, and immediately the days are going to be ticking away at high speed. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to actually make any changes while the game's paused. Heck, you can't even access the menu. So the best you can do is turn the game speed down as low as it'll go so that you'll have at least some time to build stuff up and make proper progress. But even at the lowest setting, things go by surprisingly fast. Now, to help with your first foray into making an amusement park, you have a person in the corner called the Advisor. Now, during the very brief tutorial for this game, the Advisor tells you exactly what to do. But following this, the main purpose of the advisor is to inform you of things that you wouldn't normally realize on your own accord. Specifically, the cost to set everything at, since the defaults are never right and fluctuate over the course of time, and whether or not certain rides are getting too old to be safe to continue operating. Because yeah, if a ride gets too old, it doesn't just break down more often, it has a chance to just flat out detonate and leave behind rocks that you can never remove no matter what, effectively making it impossible to reuse the land for anything else. So yeah, the main thing to do to get a park going is to build paths for visitors to walk along, rides for visitors to enjoy, queue lines for visitors to queue up into prior to getting on the rides, and stands for consumables, merchandise, and games of chance. You can also put down scenery objects, including low-end outhouses at first, because yes, you actually have to research how to have proper bathroom stalls. And these outhouses routinely cause cascading puking fits if you put them within range of anything without also dropping trees down to help mitigate the stench. Not only does the manual call attention to this, I can confirm the game is specifically checking for this, as I will now demonstrate. Anyways, you also have to hire staff and place them around the park. Staff members consist of a variety of entertainers to choose from, handymen who will wipe up trash and barf as well as mow the lawn, engineers who will fix the rides when they break down, and security guards who don't do a thing at first, but you'll know when you'll actually start needing them because you'll either catch hooligans doing mean things, or at the very least, hear them driving off on their motorcycles. And the more often they get away with stuff, the more and more of them will come to the park to make trouble. All that said, there's kind of a problem with all the staff members in this game, which I'll address a little later when it becomes pertinent. So, you've now got the basics in place. Make paths, make rides, make fun stuff, profit, right? Well, if you're doing everything right, then sure. But there's a lot more going on under the hood, which is where things start to take multiple dark turns. Now, firstly, the various rides in the park all have various settings you can adjust. By default, most rides are set to medium intensity and to be as long as possible. And for the most part, these defaults suck. And in general, you have to go in and adjust them so that the rides are shorter and more intense. But the game doesn't tell you where the sweet spots are, so you just kinda have to wing it and hope for the best. Which wouldn't be such a big deal if the park visitors actually had any useful feedback, but most of the time, they don't. The funny thing though is that there is a screen you can bring up which helps you gauge what your park visitors are thinking and feeling, but it's practically useless because 90% of your visitors are likely going to be hungry, and that thought overrides all others. Thus, you're never going to figure out if a particular ride is actually doing its job right unless you watch all the people getting on and off of it like a hawk. Not to mention, you're going to find it incredibly difficult to get that general opinion rating about your park above neutral. I mean, you can, I've done it. I don't know how I did it, but it's clearly possible. The finances screen doesn't help much either, especially considering that there's a massive discrepancy in terms of your total balance versus money in and money out. Whatever math is going on to calculate all of this is clearly doing a poor job of it. In fact, it's so poor of a job that this is what killed my second attempt at a park, because the balance on this screen was frequently showing that I had plenty of cash on hand, while my actual usable balance was in the negatives. Yeah, not exactly sure how that happened, but not even restarting the game fixed this discrepancy. Speaking of finances, there's an entire stock market system in place, so you can buy and sell stocks in your own park and the rival parks being run in the background. But I didn't even remotely understand how this was working, so I was more than happy to disable it. And the same goes for the stocks of perishable goods, as I could place orders for this stuff, but what I bought would keep running out really quick, even with a full order, and thus I couldn't really get a grasp on how much stuff I should be buying or when, so I was okay with having that disabled too. And then, as I was finally starting to get a handle on things, suddenly this happened. And within a matter of seconds, nearly all of my workers were on strike and picketing out at the front of my park. Okay, so At this point of my script, I was going to take a moment to briefly explain the realities of unions, the pros and cons, when they work, when they don't, but a lot of it is way above my level of knowledge and expertise, and quite frankly, regardless of your opinions about unions, it's an extremely uncomfortable topic that we generally don't like talking about unless we have to. So what the hell is it doing in my fun game about building an amusement park? I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this before. In fact, I think I mentioned this fairly recently. But one of the big reasons why I play video games is escapism. I don't want to be reminded of the harshness of reality when I'm playing games. I just want to sit down and have a good time. And being reminded that ginormous corporations suck and frequently take advantage of workers to the point where they have to unionize while placing me in the position of the corporate overlord, just no. That is not something I want to be reminded about in a game that looks like this. Now, I'm not saying you can't have unions represented in a game, but you can't just throw them into something like this and expect players to go, hey, I get to negotiate with unions! What a fun thing to do! Now that I know I can do union negotiations, I am sold on buying this game with my hard-earned cash. You want to know the biggest irony, though? I mean, the irony of all ironies? You all thought I was being facetious just now, when in fact, union negotiations are a selling point on the back of the box. Is this a bad time to point out that this game was sponsored by Midland Bank, one of the 4 largest banking institutions in the UK at the time? I feel like this is either a bad time to point out that this game was sponsored by Midland Bank, or the best time to point that out since it kinda explains a lot. Because yeah, this game is steeped far too heavily into the big business side of things, and it is a major turnoff to me in terms of how this game progresses. Especially when you consider the end goal of this game, which I'm not gonna get to just yet because we actually still haven't really touched on research yet. So yeah, the research system in this game is kind of weird. I mean, it makes sense once you know what you're doing, but basically this screen has you set research levels through a sort of fluid system, where you click on the tube at the top to set how much money to pour into research on a regular basis, and then the smaller vats let you distribute that fluid relatively speaking. Thus, when you adjust the total up top, it also automatically adjusts how much goes into each smaller vat, with a number of small indicators under each vat to indicate when major breakthroughs are reached. Now, this research system is used for 2 major things. The obvious thing is that it unlocks more structures to build, thus allowing you a greater variety of things in your park, and thus a greater level of attraction and the ability to set higher ticket prices. But only half of the vats control getting those structures. The other 3 vats are dedicated to improving the things you already have, specifically improving rides so they don't break down as often, training staff members to do their jobs better because they are abysmal at doing their jobs early in the game, and improving more subtle things like how many people can be brought to and from your park by the bus at a time, and how much stock you can order at once for your shops. Naturally, these improvements are kind of necessary to keep your park going strong in the long run, especially with all the competition you're facing in the background in terms of your rivals. And therein lies the major issue of this game. I mean, I could go into a diatribe about how the mouse controls are abysmal and delayed, or how the speed of the game is completely inconsistent, especially given the constant swapping between screen resolutions, and how it's surprisingly difficult to open the menu or get new research to appear on screen instead of getting cancelled out, how absolutely none of the research you do carries over between parks, even though your cash flow does, and how the game's weather effects also darken the UI, making it difficult to do anything, and how the pathfinding in the game is actually atrocious and frequently forms invisible gaps you can't see, which cause people to wander off or fail to use things which are very clearly connected properly. No, those are all very annoying things for sure, but they don't hold a candle to this game's one major issue. It is intentionally built for you to lose if you continue playing the same park for too long. Yeah, you are fighting an uphill battle no matter which game mode you're in, which gets steeper and steeper the longer it goes. Well, at least if you keep the rivals on, but then turning the rivals off has a run-on effect to how this game ends, so that's almost just as bad an idea. But generally speaking, the game mode you're in determines why you can't play the same park for too long. If you're playing the full simulation experience and stay on the same park for too long, sooner or later your rivals are going to outpace you, it's just a matter of time, and when they get far enough ahead, one of those rivals is going to start buying stocks in your park, and if they buy enough stocks in your park, you're done. Goodbye. Now, if you turn off the full simulation experience and just go partway into the simulation experience, then your rivals can never buy out your park, but sooner or later, your staff and goods negotiations are going to outpace what people are willing to spend to get in and buy stuff, and thus your expenses will start to outpace your income, and you'll be bankrupt before you know it. If you're in the sandbox mode, though, there won't be any of that, but you can never upgrade your rides or train your staff. This means your staff members will perpetually be terrible at their jobs, and you'll constantly be replacing rides all the time because of how frequently they'll be breaking down, thus sucking the fun out of running the park in the first place, since all the early game micromanagement, which is tempered by research, just becomes a nightmare trying to handle with a bigger park. Thus, the game is intentionally geared to encourage you to sell your park when it's at peak operations. Yeah, forget about nurturing and building up the same park for countless hours on end and just having fun making it the best place you can. Nope, this game is specifically geared so that once your park is as good as you think you can make it, you're supposed to auction it off for cash as if you didn't really care about it, and just saw it as a stepping stone on the path to becoming a billionaire. Did I already mention this game was sponsored by a UK banking institution? I think I already mentioned this game was sponsored by a UK banking institution. Well, I said it at the beginning, but I'll say it again. Overall, I hate Theme Park. This game is steeped so heavily in corporate shenanigans that it drowns out what should have been an extraordinarily fun amusement park building experience. Earlier, I compared this game to Roller Coaster Tycoon, which came out a few years later. Because at first glance, both games play extremely similarly, but every single bit of the corporate nonsense that pervades Theme Park is absent from Roller Coaster Tycoon. Plus, that game specifically encourages you to build your park as big and as bold as you can possibly make it. And I have a very funny feeling Chris Sawyer made Roller Coaster Tycoon the way he did because he took one look at Theme Park and formed the same opinion about it I just did. Too much corporate and not enough giving a damn. Now, despite all of that, I'm not saying Theme Park is a bad game. There's a lot to like here, and when it came out, it was definitely novel and ingenious. And if you know how to play this one flawlessly, you're gonna have a good time with it. But this formula's been done way better since, and I only recommend giving this old game a try if you're morbidly curious. Otherwise, stick with Roller Coaster Tycoon. Or heck, the second one's even better than the first one, and both games are available on GOG. Though it's easy to miss them because you have to remember to put a space between roller and coaster. Otherwise, you'll pull up a weird hybrid mobile port thing done in 2017, which no one likes all that much. Yeah, I'll just put links to all of these in the video description, save everyone some headaches. So, the speed of the game is unfortunately horribly inconsistent, a problem which you find with a lot of early Bullfrog titles, but it's really bad here if you decide to play with the SVGA graphics, given the frequent swaps back to VGA temporarily. Now, if you stick with VGA exclusively, then the speed is a little more consistent, but then you have very little viewing space and everything's going to feel cramped. In any case, with the VGA graphics, I recommend a cycles count of 10,000, and with the SVGA graphics, I recommend a cycles count of 20,000. The rest should work without any extra configuration. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on February 18th, will be another review, episode 309, where we're going to be taking a look at a first-person shooter which was put out by a publisher mostly known for strategy games. Yeah, not entirely certain how that ended up happening, but make sure to stay tuned to see how such a game could have possibly turned out. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join the ranks of everyone you see here supporting the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.